Good evening and welcome to today's edition of Teach Me Tuesday. Today we are going to talk about one of my most favorite things, and that is the placenta. I have this weird thing about the placenta and how much I think it really can tell you about what your baby's story in the NICU is going to be like. I talk about how it's the greatest temporary organ to ever exist. Even though many people remind me it's the only temporary organ to ever exist, I still think it's the greatest. So today we're going to talk about the placenta and how when something happens to the placenta, it can affect some different diagnoses for our babies. So let's review. Let's talk about that placenta. When does it form? How does it form? What's going on in there? There are amazing videos and illustrations here on YouTube that tell you all about the placenta. I love watching them and kind of getting that visual of how it's all connecting together. But it's important to remember that there's a baby side of the placenta and a mom side of the placenta. And in between, it's almost like this current pathway or this river that the blood is flowing through, and it's picking up and dropping off different things it needs, and almost like these tributaries, but really they're just the villi inside of the placenta. But if you get that picture, or I kind of think of it like caves with stalagmites and stalactites, like what's going on in there and what are each of those little areas doing. But it begins to form within 6 to 10 days of the fertilization of the egg. The placenta formation is a huge part of the baby's gestation, and so it forms early. And then by week 10 to 12, really it is taking over and providing the basic functions of life for the baby. So when we think about the placenta, it has a lot of functions that it does. One of the biggest ones that we really focus on in the NICU is that the placenta is acting as the respiratory system. If you think about a baby in the uterus gestating and growing, they are floating around in fluid, right? They have lungs that are kind of filled with fluid, amniotic fluid and dead space, and it has this really low pressure. There's a low PaO2, so the lungs aren't really doing anything. They are not expanding and contracting and inhaling and exhaling for gas exchange. The alveoli are not open and functioning. So in absence of functioning lungs, the placenta has to do the job of exchanging carbon dioxide and oxygen. And just connecting those pieces together and thinking about if anything were to happen to the placenta, you can see how easily the gas exchange would become impaired. Once gas exchange is impaired, then there's a buildup of CO2, of acid within the baby's body, within the baby's blood. They become acidotic, they become hypoxic, they can become stressed. All of those environmental changes to the baby are going to contribute to how well they are growing and functioning and just being within the uterus. It also tells you a lot about what happens to them when they come out, when there have been issues to the placenta. The placenta also kind of acts as a kidney, right? The kidneys don't do a lot of work in utero. And then when we think about, hey, the kidney's not supposed to do that much work at the beginning, then the baby comes out early. This is why our babies have such unstable electrolytes in those first few days of life, especially when they're born prematurely. Their kidneys aren't supposed to do that yet. And now they're out here, we're asking them to do things, and then we're asking them to process things like TPN. Like, shocker that they can't quite do that. But it's going to be an electrolyte and an acid balancer. It removes waste, and it's also contributing to the hormone balance within the baby. The placenta also acts as a nutrient support for the mom and the baby. So the mom will actually, the placenta will pull from the mom's stores in order to grow babies. This is why when you see those pictures of women in third world countries who they themselves are emaciated, they will be able to grow a baby because the placenta will pull it, almost like leach the mom of her essential nutrients in order for the baby to grow. They will look for vitamins, iron, folate, and a big push of this happens during that third trimester. That's why babies that are born prior to completing the third trimester need extra vitamins and minerals during that time in the NICU. And even if they go home before 40 or 42 weeks, that's why they might be on supplemented feeds or get some formula feeds and some breast milk feeds, because they just missed that push, especially of the calcium and phosphorus for laying their bones down. So the placenta is also regulating how the baby is getting the nutrients. So there's lots of maternal conditions that can contribute to the placenta not functioning correctly. I believe that if we can understand our baby's story of what was happening to them in utero and during their delivery, it can really influence what we know about their current state and their projected time in the NICU. A baby in stress builds them up to potentially have certain outcomes, which we'll talk about a few of those today. But hypertension, diabetes, infection, babies that are born post-dates. Remember, we talk about the placenta being the greatest temporary organ to ever exist. It is meant to function for about 40 weeks. The longer we get away from that 40-week mark, it's an organ, right? It's going to start to degenerate. It is not going to be able to exchange the gases as well. It's not going to be able to supply the baby with the blood supply and the oxygen that they need. It is a very interesting piece to think about when you're thinking about those post-term babies and kind of what is going on with them and what their risks are. When you think of preeclampsia or hypertension in general, right, that's just that it's going to cause a constriction on the blood flow to the baby, and because of a decreased blood flow to the placenta. So if the placenta doesn't have enough blood, it's not going to give enough blood to the baby. It might change the oxygenation going to the baby. Any of the maternal health conditions or medications that mom might be on can also affect how well the placenta works. Trauma. I've seen a mom after a rollover car accident in the emergency room where they are scanning to see what's happening to her placenta and watching for placental abruption to really see, like, hey, what's going on with this placenta? Was it damaged during this traumatic event? So what happens when something goes wrong, right? Maybe we have a traumatic event. Maybe you have a placental abruption. Maybe we have severe hypertension and now we're going into preeclampsia. This can cause hypoxia, anemia. It contributes to HIE, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. This can contribute to NEC, respiratory insufficiency, IVH. We think about IVH in that intraventricular hemorrhage where there's maybe been a decreased blood supply to the baby from the placenta, from something that's going on with mom. Then the baby comes out and now we give them fluids and it kind of rushes those vessels and it causes them to get really big really fast. And that can cause the hemorrhaging within their cerebellum and within their brain. So all of these things, and something going wrong with the placenta alone can contribute to premature delivery. We're going to break down two of these diagnoses and talk about them a little bit. So let's talk about how placental insufficiency may contribute to NEC. So really what this comes down to is the idea of how much oxygenated blood is flowing to the babies and where is it going to go. The body is always going to concentrate on kind of what I call the big three: the brain, the heart, the lungs. So this amount of oxygenated blood that's coming into the baby from the placenta is going to prioritize those organs. When those are well perfused, then it keeps going. It's going to get the liver. It's going to get the kidneys. Probably the gut is lowest on the priority list. Seems wild to have the gut as lowest on the priority list, but it is. So that gut has had periods of times during the gestation of this baby where it has had decreased blood flow. Because of that, some cells may die. They may become more susceptible to bacteria, and that in turn will allow NEC to be able to form in there. Now, it doesn't mean that every baby that is born of a hypertensive mom or a mom with preeclampsia or placental abruption is going to have NEC. It is just one of the contributing factors that can lead to NEC, and really just making it more susceptible, more permeable to the bacteria that will lead to NEC. Now let's talk about how placenta insufficiency may contribute to HIE. So if we just look at three things that can go on with the placenta: previa, right? Placental previa, that's when the placenta is sitting on top of the cervix. And when you think about a baby's job prior to delivery is for the head to descend and for the head to kind of thin out the cervix so that the cervix will expand so the baby can come out. And now you have this very, vasculature organ, the placenta sitting there, and we've got this head pushing on it. It can lead to compression. It can lead to compression of the placenta, compression of the cord, and the baby in general just doesn't have room. It also can lead to bleeding, right? So all three of those things are going to contribute to what's going on, to having a decreased blood flow, which can lead to HIE. Abruption, again, is when that placenta partially or completely separates from the inner wall of the uterus. Obviously, that is just a bleeding risk, and that deprives the baby of oxygen and nutrients. When you think of a creta, right, the placenta is implanted too deep into the uterine wall. That puts the baby at high risk for bleeding, the mom and the baby at high risk for bleeding, but also if you think about contractions starting on an organ that's in the middle of this muscle, that can be very dangerous to the baby, and then the placenta will get squished, and again, that is going to cut down on the oxygen and the nutrients that can get to the baby. Anytime that there is a decreased blood supply and oxygenated blood getting to the baby, that is a risk factor for HIE, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. So the placenta, in a recap here, right? The placenta is really working to regulate the baby's functions in utero, eliminating waste. It also builds immune properties, right? Even another thing we weren't able to get into today. So knowing what happens to your placenta, even if your baby has been in the NICU for 10 or 12 weeks, you're a patient that day, you say to yourself, well, this mom had hypertension and placental previa. Those are two risk factors that make me think I need to be extra cautious. I need to be watching for signs of neck. I need to see what's going on with this baby and see if there could be any other risk factors. Maybe your placenta, your baby's delivered early, mom had some preeclampsia, and you think to yourself, this is probably why we are still on the ventilator. There's respiratory insufficiency because the placenta was not able to supply the right nutrients to the baby during their growth periods in utero. So that's our coverage of the placenta today. If you have any questions, please comment below, and we will see you next Tuesday for another round of Teach Me Tuesday.